Everyone said she was a lost cause, but something inside me refused to believe it. Hi, my name is Jada Brooks, and this is the story of how, as a young doctor, I took on the case nobody wanted and somehow pulled off the impossible. Before we jump into the action, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more awesome content, and hit the bell so you never miss out. Let's go back to that day in New York City when my whole life changed. I had just finished my residency at Mount Sinai Hospital. I was the youngest doctor in my department and the only black woman. A lot of people smiled politely at me, but I knew they didn't take me seriously. Then he walked in, Grant Whitmore, tech billionaire, known for being ruthless and for protecting his family at all costs. Trailing behind him was his mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Her eyes were closed. Her body looked hollow. She hadn't spoken in almost 2 months. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "They all failed. But you're different, aren't you?" Mount Sinai's private wing was quiet. Too quiet. The air smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. I remember the soft squeak of Eleanor's wheelchair as they rolled her into the exam room. She had been seen by top neurologists from Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, even overseas experts. MRIs, CT scans, blood panels, all clear. Official diagnosis: idiopathic optic neuropathy, possibly psychological factors involved. Translation: we don't know what's wrong. Maybe it's all in her head. But I noticed something. While Eleanor looked unresponsive, her right hand was subtly twitching, like she was trying to hold on to something. A memory, a feeling. Later that night, flipping through her thick medical file in my tiny studio apartment, I spotted a barely legible note from a visiting medical student. Patient whispered during sleep, "Red dress, red river," repeated it 3 times. I froze. I started digging. Spoke with her longtime housekeeper. She told me about a gala event Eleanor had attended 3 months earlier, a children's charity fundraiser in Central Park. Kids performing skits, some wearing costumes. She saw something there, the housekeeper said. Came home. Different. When I asked Grant, he stiffened. She collapsed that night, he admitted. Mumbled something about losing a little girl. A daughter she lost. A secret no one dared mention. This wasn't just physical. It was emotional, traumatic. So I took a risk. I asked Grant to let me take her back, to where it started. We brought Eleanor back to the Children's Center near Central Park. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. The smell of popcorn and balloons filled the air. As we wheeled her in, a little girl in a bright red dress skipped past us. Eleanor gasped. Her eyes, shut for months, blinked open. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And then, the words, "Maddie, I'm sorry." I later learned Maddie was her daughter. She drowned in the Hudson River during a summer picnic, wearing a red dress. The guilt had buried itself so deep inside Eleanor. Her mind and body had shut down to protect her. We started intensive therapy immediately, not just medical, trauma recovery. 3 months later, Eleanor Whitmore walked into my clinic, smiling, independent, free. Grant hugged me, something nobody had ever seen him do, apparently. And the next day, he sent me an envelope with a handwritten note. "Thank you for saving the only person who ever mattered to me. Here's your future." Inside was a deed to a brand new trauma recovery center in Manhattan, funded entirely by the Whitmore Foundation. I stared at the paper in my hands. A deed. My name in bold ink. My hands trembling. I'd gone to med school to help people, but this was a legacy. The trauma center was built fast. And not just because of the money, but because Grant wouldn't take no for an answer. He'd call city inspectors, schedule contractors at 3 a.m., and personally handpick art for the walls. He said, "If this place gave my mom her life back, then let's give that to others too." We named it the Maddie Center after his sister, a tribute to the girl in the red dress, the one Eleanor never stopped loving. Opening day came faster than I expected. The city was buzzing, news stations, cameras, and more than a few raised eyebrows. A black woman, in her 20s, running a state-of-the-art trauma center in Manhattan. People were watching, waiting for me to trip, but we didn't. The first patient we took in was a young woman named Alina, 21, homeless, diagnosed with dissociative amnesia after escaping an abusive foster home. She hadn't spoken in weeks. I sat with her every evening. No lab coat, no clipboard, just me, just presence. Some nights, we colored together. Some nights, we sat in silence. One night, she looked up and said, "Do you think monsters ever stop chasing you?" I said, "Only when you stop running and realize you're stronger than they are." She cried for an hour, but after that night, she started healing. Grant became more involved, showing up unannounced, sitting in on staff meetings, offering suggestions. At first, I didn't mind, but soon it became clear. He wasn't just funding the place, he thought he was running it. We clashed over patient privacy, over protocols, over how much media attention was too much. One day, I confronted him after he leaked a patient success story to a local paper without consent. "Grant," I said, "this isn't your PR project. These are people." He stared at me, and for the first time, he looked hurt. He quietly said, "I don't know how to be useful if I'm not fixing something." That hit me. Behind all that billionaire bravado was a man who never got over watching his mother fall apart and didn't know how to let go now that she was whole again. It was Eleanor who brought us back together. She walked into my office one evening, wearing her signature blue shawl, and said, "Grant thinks he saved me, but really, you saved both of us." She helped mediate a long, quiet dinner between us. We talked, really talked. He told me how powerless he'd felt, watching every expert fail his mom, until I came along. I told him how lonely it felt, being the youngest and only black doctor in every room, until I saw what we could build together. By the end of the night, we weren't just colleagues, we were partners. But then something shifted. One by one, patients started canceling appointments. 2 of our top therapists quit within the same week. And late one night, I saw a news headline that made my stomach drop. Whitmore Foundation under federal investigation for tax fraud and money laundering. What? I called Grant, straight to voicemail. I drove to his penthouse, but the concierge said he hadn't been seen in days. The center's funding froze the next day. I had to gather the staff, doctors, social workers, security, and tell them everything was paused until further notice. It felt like a betrayal. 2 days later, Grant showed up, unshaven, exhausted, eyes bloodshot. He sat down in my office and closed the door. "Jada, someone's framing me, an ex-partner, but they're coming for everything, including the Maddie Center." I didn't care about the money. I cared about Alina, about the single moms, the veterans, the abuse survivors, all of them depending on this place. I looked him in the eye and said, "Then we fight. You gave me this. Let me protect it." We went non-profit, cut the Whitmore Foundation out completely. I raised funds from local businesses, launched a GoFundMe, spoke on podcasts, at churches, at rallies. People rallied behind us, behind me. Because it was never about a billionaire's money. It was about people believing in second chances. And now, the Maddie Center is expanding to Philly and Chicago. Alina works here now as a peer counselor. Eleanor runs our art therapy class on weekends, and Grant, he volunteers anonymously away from the cameras. At first, it was weird seeing Grant mopping hallways or refilling the coffee bar. No Armani suits, no flashing smile, just a guy trying to do something good without the world watching. Sometimes, I caught him sneaking art supplies into the therapy rooms or leaving handmade cards on patients' beds. One night, I found him fixing a broken door handle himself, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease across his cheek. When I teased him about it, he just shrugged and said, "Not everything that saves people needs headlines, Doc." I smiled, thinking, "Neither do you, Grant." It was a rainy Thursday when someone knocked on my office door. I looked up, and my breath caught. It was Dr. Samuel Green, one of the very doctors who had given up on Eleanor all those years ago. Back then, he'd barely glanced at me during case conferences, treated me like a note-taker, not a doctor. Now, he was standing there, hat in hand, asking me for a job. "I heard about what you built here," he said quietly, "and I want to be part of it. If you'll have me." I could have rubbed it in. I could have made him beg. Instead, I thought about Alina, about Eleanor, about second chances. I stood, offered my hand, and said, "Welcome to the Maddie Center, Dr. Green." Weeks passed. The center thrived. We hosted free clinics for trauma survivors, added evening programs for veterans and first responders. The waiting list grew faster than we could handle. One evening after a long shift, Eleanor pulled me aside, looking mischievous. "Have you checked the donations ledger lately?" I blinked. "I mean, I skim it. Why?" She grinned and handed me a printout. Page after page of anonymous $5,000 donations, every single week. The initials at the bottom of the bank transfers? G.W. Grant, Whitmore. He wasn't just volunteering, he was quietly keeping the center alive, refusing to take any credit. It hit me in the chest, but peace never lasts long, does it? One evening, just after closing, a sharply dressed woman showed up at the front desk. Lawyer, judging by the briefcase. She introduced herself as Melanie Ward, representing a group of investors who had quietly bought out the building's mortgage before we went nonprofit. Now, they wanted to turn the Maddie Center into luxury condos. I felt the blood drain from my face. I called an emergency meeting with the staff. Some cried, some raged, some wanted to give up, but not me, and not Grant. He looked around the room and said, "They think they can scare us off because we don't have billions behind us anymore. They're wrong. We have something better. We have this city." The next 2 months were brutal. We organized rallies. Patients told their stories to the press. Local TV stations picked up the fight. Big developers versus Trauma Recovery Center. Every night I went home exhausted. Every morning I woke up more determined. Grant surprised me one morning with a worn-out campaign t-shirt from his mother's activism days. It said, "We heal together." I wore it under my white coat every day after that. Just when it seemed we'd lose the building, a miracle happened. A massive donation, $2.5 million, from an anonymous benefactor. Enough to buy back the building outright. At the press conference, the reporter asked me, "Do you know who saved the center?" I smiled and said, "A believer in second chances." I knew it was Grant. He'd mortgaged his last few remaining properties, the few he had left after the federal investigation. He never asked for credit. He never would. But I'd always know. Now every patient who walks through our doors sees a plaque near the entrance. It reads, "The Maddie Center, where healing finds a home, founded by those who refuse to give up." Grant still volunteers, still fixes broken chairs, and stocks the supply closet without a word. Sometimes, when he thinks no one's looking, he stands by the entrance, watching the patients come and go, a soft, proud look in his eyes. I think he finally understands. It was never about saving people. It was about walking beside them while they saved themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that's what saved him too. Life at the Maddie Center settled into a steady rhythm. Every morning, the smell of fresh coffee and the soft hum of laughter in the hallways reminded me why we fought so hard to keep this place alive. It wasn't just a clinic. It was a sanctuary, a second chance for all of us, even Grant, especially Grant. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I noticed a woman lingering at the reception desk. She looked familiar. Something about her eyes, cautious but hopeful, pulled at my memory. Eleanor waved me over. "Dr. Jada, she asked for you specifically." I approached, smiling warmly. The woman shifted nervously before speaking. "You probably don't remember me," she said, voice trembling. "But I was one of your patients years ago, when no one else would take my case." I blinked, heart racing. "Maya," I whispered. She nodded, tears brimming. Maya had been one of my first patients, a young woman suffering from a trauma so severe she couldn't speak for months. She disappeared after discharge. No calls, no updates. I feared the worst. Yet here she was, standing tall, healthy, eyes shining. We sat together in my office, mugs of herbal tea between us. She told me about the shelter she stayed in, the nights she wanted to give up, the strangers who showed her small kindnesses, enough to keep her going, and then how she found work at a local bookstore, finished her GED, and enrolled in a social work program. Now, she wanted to come back, not as a patient, but as a volunteer. "You saved me," she said softly. "Now I want to help save others." My throat tightened. This was why we built the Maddie Center. Word about the Maddie Center spread faster than we could manage. Families, veterans, abuse survivors, all seeking a place to heal. Our tiny staff was drowning. We needed more therapists, more rooms, more resources. Grant suggested expanding into the abandoned lot next door, turning it into a second wing. But there was one problem. We didn't own the lot, and the owner, a stubborn old tycoon named Richard Vaughn, refused to sell. "Sentimental reasons," his lawyer said. Vaughn's late wife used to run a flower shop there. It sat empty now, a decaying relic of a love gone by. One evening, after a long shift, Grant showed up at my office with 2 cups of bad diner coffee and a mischievous grin. "We're going on a field trip," he said. He drove us across town to a tiny, dusty library. Inside, he introduced me to an old librarian named Mrs. Penelope Reeves, Vaughn's childhood friend. Grant worked his charm, and after 2 hours of awkward tea sipping and memory sharing, Penelope agreed to arrange a meeting. "But be warned," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "Richard Vaughn's heart is a vault, and it's been locked a long, long time." Vaughn agreed to meet at a diner, his choice, at precisely 6 o'clock p.m. sharp. I arrived early, palms sweaty, rehearsing my pitch. When he finally walked in, cane tapping, scowl deep, I realized no amount of rehearsing would prepare me. He didn't even sit. "Say what you came to say, doctor." So I did. I told him about Maya, about Alina, about the hundreds of lives transformed inside the Maddie Center. I told him about my own journey, a black girl who refused to let anyone else write her story. By the time I finished, he said nothing for a long while. Finally, he pulled out a faded photograph, his wife, smiling in front of the flower shop. She loved helping people, he whispered. Maybe it's time I did too. 2 weeks later, we received the deed to the lot, gifted to the Maddie Center at no cost. Along with it, a simple letter, in memory of Lillian Vaughn. May love grow here again. We broke ground on the new wing that summer. Grant insisted on painting the first brick himself. An old construction tradition, he said. We let the community vote on a name for the new building. The Lillian Wing, a garden of second chances. It felt right. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Maya stood at the podium, tears shining in her eyes. She wasn't the scared, broken girl from years ago. She was a leader now, a beacon. Watching her speak, I realized something powerful. Saving people doesn't always look like TV dramas or viral headlines. Sometimes it's a quiet hand offered in the dark. Sometimes it's a center built from broken dreams and stubborn hope. Sometimes it's a rich man mopping floors when no one's watching. And sometimes it's a scared girl, once abandoned, standing tall and fierce, ready to change the world. And watching Maya standing there, I realized something else, something that nearly stole my breath away. I had become the kind of person I once desperately needed when I was younger. Not a savior, not a miracle worker, just someone stubborn enough to believe that healing, real, messy, imperfect healing, was possible. But good things don't stay simple for long. Barely a month after the grand opening of the Lillian Wing, I received a thick envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name scrawled across the front. Inside, a formal-looking letter, stamped with the seal of the National Behavioral Health Alliance. I frowned, heart thumping. They were inviting me to speak at a national summit in Washington, D.C. The topic, Innovative Models for Community Trauma Recovery. It was the kind of opportunity people waited decades for, and honestly, it terrified me. Grant found me staring at the letter that evening, frozen. "You have to do it," he said without hesitation. "What if I'm not good enough?" I whispered. He smiled, that quiet, stubborn smile of his. "You're already changing the world, Jada. They just want to hear how you're doing it." The weeks leading up to the summit were brutal. Between patient loads, overseeing construction crews, and endless paperwork, I barely had time to breathe. I spent late nights hunched over my laptop, crafting and recrafting my speech. I wanted every word to honor the people who trusted us with their stories, their pain, their hope, not statistics, not buzzwords, real lives. One night, around 2 a.m., I got stuck on a sentence. I sat there, frustrated, when Maya poked her head into my office. She looked at the draft, then simply said, "Tell them about us. Tell them the truth." It was so simple, and exactly right. Standing backstage at the DC Conference Center, clutching my note cards, I felt like an imposter. All around me were suits, polished speeches, carefully rehearsed smiles. When they called my name, I nearly stumbled onto the stage. The lights were blinding. Hundreds of faces stared up at me. I took a breath. Then I told them everything. About the patients no one believed could recover. About the nights we almost gave up. About the stubborn, ridiculous hope that built the Maddie Center brick by brick. And about the scared girl, the one I used to be, who decided not to quit. When I finished, the room was silent. For a terrible second, I thought I had failed. And then, a standing ovation. Not polite, not obligatory, real. raw. Afterward, people lined up to shake my hand. Directors, advocates, even a senator. Everyone wanted to talk about expansion, about replicating the Maddie Center model across the country. One woman, a hospital administrator from Detroit, gripped my hands tightly. "We need this," she said, tears in her eyes. "We need you." The idea terrified me. Scaling up meant losing control. It meant bureaucracy. It meant risking the very soul of what we built. But it also meant saving more Mayas. And wasn't that the whole point? That night, back at the hotel, I sat by the window staring out at the Washington skyline. Grant called. "How'd it go?" "Good. Maybe too good." I laughed softly. I told him about the offers, the possibilities. There was a long pause. Then he said, "If anyone can scale hope without selling out, it's you. Just remember who you're building it for." I thought about that for a long time, and the next morning, I called the Detroit hospital administrator. We scheduled a site visit. Back in New York, I gathered the team. Maya sat up front, notebook open, eyes shining. I laid it out for them. We have a chance to create Maddie centers across the country, places where scared girls, wounded soldiers, lost souls, anyone can come heal. The room buzzed with excitement and fear. It would mean hard work, risk, change, but it could also mean a future we barely dared dream of when this all began. I ended the meeting with the same words that Grant once told me when I was doubting myself. "We're already changing the world. They just want to hear how we're doing it." As the team filed out, Maya lingered behind. She handed me a small, hand-painted rock. On it were 4 simple words: "Plant seeds, grow hope." I tucked it into my pocket, heart full. We weren't just treating trauma anymore. We were building forests from broken roots. And somehow, I knew we were just getting started. We chose Detroit, not because it was easy. It wasn't. Not because we had the funding. We didn't. But because the need was undeniable. We toured neighborhoods riddled with silent grief. Kids walking home past boarded-up houses. Parents working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Trauma passed down like heirlooms. I met with city officials, teachers, even pastors, and one face stood out. Dr. Lacey Hart, a no-nonsense ER trauma nurse with sleeves rolled up and eyes that had seen too much. "If you can do here what you did in New York," she said, folding her arms, "then I'm all in." That was all the permission I needed. The Detroit Maddie Center was different from day one. We couldn't rely on polished grants or big press features here. Instead, we hosted community barbecues in church parking lots. We cleaned up abandoned lots. We walked door to door, handing out flyers. Maya came too, handing out teddy bears she'd packed herself. The center wasn't even built yet, but hope had already moved in. Then the good news hit. A local foundation pledged $2 million in funding, enough to finish construction, staff up, and even build a mobile mental health unit. But there was a catch. The foundation, Broderick Wellness Trust, had history. Their money was clean, sure, but their reputation, murky. They'd been involved in privatizing low-income clinics before, sometimes slashing services after cutting red tape. When I voiced my concerns, their rep smiled politely. "We believe in your vision, Dr. Jada, but vision without funding is just a dream." That night, I didn't sleep. Grant, ever my anchor, said what I was afraid to hear. If they control your budget, they'll control your mission. I took the risk anyway, because the need in Detroit was that urgent. And deep down, I wanted to believe they meant well. At first, everything was smooth. The building went up fast. Dr. Lacey ran the ER wing like clockwork. Maya launched a teen outreach program that was overflowing within 2 weeks. Then, came the first memo. A Broderick rep emailed us asking to review our service efficiency. They wanted shorter session times, fewer one-on-ones, more online modules. I pushed back, hard. We don't treat spreadsheets, we treat people. The next week, 2 social workers were mysteriously reassigned by the foundation. That's when I knew we weren't in control anymore. But nothing hurt more than what happened next. Maya had been working closely with Broderick's youth liaison, a charismatic young exec named Jordan Kane. He was charming, encouraging, always praising her work. I trusted him, until I found out he'd offered Maya a private grant, under the table, to leave the Maddie Center and start a separate teen wellness app. He told her she'd outgrown the center, that she didn't need me anymore. Maya told me everything, in tears. I thought he cared about our work, Jada, about you. I felt gutted, not because I was losing Maya, she'd never betray me, but because I'd let corporate wolves into a sanctuary we built with blood, sweat, and grace. I called a meeting the next day. Everyone, Lacey, Maya, Grant, volunteers, patients. This place wasn't built on compromise, I said. It was built on belief, real, stubborn belief in healing. The Broderick team wasn't invited. That night, with unanimous support, we drafted a letter terminating their funding and partnership. We knew it would hurt. It meant scaling back, delaying programs, even freezing hiring, but we'd rather grow slower than sell our soul. 1 week later, a check arrived, anonymously, $1.8 million, with a note: protect what you've built. The world needs more places like this. We never found out who sent it. Maybe a senator, maybe a patient, maybe the universe. Finally catching up. All I knew was this: the Maddie Center in Detroit would open on time, without compromise, without betrayal, and with Maya right beside me, painting a mural that read, "We rise by healing." But just when I thought things were stable, an unexpected call came in. It was from Los Angeles, a young girl, barely 19, claiming she was my sister. The call disconnected before I could ask another question. Now, I don't know if it was real, or someone testing me, but one thing's for sure: the past has a way of knocking when you least expect it. What do you think will happen when Jada finds the girl in LA? Is it really her sister, or something darker? Comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that move, challenge, and inspire.